Welcome to a new episode of Legitimate Matters. I am your host, William Parris. How often have we heard conversations, either on the news, CNN, MSNBC, whatever your preferred station is, about climate change, global warming? Do we really know what that means? Sometimes I take it for granted. I understand that it's important, but how important is that? And how does it really affect me? How does it really affect you? Well, this is a show that you might want to pay attention to, because what you're going to learn today is something that will affect not just you, but as well as your children. My guest today is Dr. Richard Smith, who has a PhD in chemical oceanography, and he's an expert in biochemical processes in coastal marine systems. He has over a decade of experience in the analysis and interpretation of marine and terrestrially driven biomarks in sediments, and has spent the last several years using nitrogen-stable isotopic tracers to examine the fate of munitions contamination in aquatic systems. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for the introduction, William. It's nice to be here.
Well, when I was reading your accolades and your credentials, I was even stumbling over some of the words myself, because this is not something that we often read every day. So for my viewers, can you just tell me, who is Dr. Richard Smith, and what is it that you do, and tell us about your company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an oceanographer, as you pointed out. Specifically within that field, I'm an aquatic organic geochemist. So what I do is I look at both the big picture of, but also the detailed transformations of organic material throughout the globe as a whole, but specifically in oceans, wetlands, and rivers and lakes. I have my bachelor's degree in both environmental science, specifically aquatic ecology, and also in chemistry, with really a focus on biochemistry.
Okay.
My PhD work was where I kind of gained my expertise in organic geochemistry, which is where we actually look at individual molecules and how they trace throughout the environment, and how we can use those to reconstruct historical environments and look at modern changes. So when you mentioned biomarkers, biomarkers are basically organic molecules where we can trace back what the source of those is, and we know what they tell us about past environments when we reconstruct things like sediment cores.
So as the viewer is listening to this and they hear a lot of scientific jargon, can you kind of hone in and tell us about your individual research specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I focus on a process called carbon burial, which is, if we think about the carbon cycle on land, forests take up carbon dioxide, they build biomass, but when they die and this biomass turns over, they decay, it fluxes back as carbon dioxide, so it's a short-term storage. There's a slow leak of carbon locked in organic molecules from land to the ocean, and that gets removed from this active process as it gets buried in deep sediments and removed from oxygen. And that has controlled atmospheric concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide over long periods of time, geologic timescales, or has been one of the key drivers of that.
So one thing, you mentioned the forest. You mentioned oxygen. You talked about a relationship between the forest and then aquatic studies, which is the ocean, and then the atmosphere. So tie that in together, because if I'm the viewer and I'm sitting here and I hear what you're saying, why is that important to me? Because I hear a lot, but why should I pay attention to this?
Well, this is how we understand how the environment has changed in the past and how climate has changed in the past. So as oceanographers and as environmental scientists, we're constantly taking records of past temperatures, carbon dioxide concentrations, what was going on in the oceans. So this is how we know about these processes.
Tell us about the carbon. Be more specific about that, because explain the carbon and what and how that affects us. What's going on with that?
Well, right now we're at about 408 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. We know that right now carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are one of the key drivers of warming atmospheric temperatures. Mm-hmm. Essentially, over the last 800,000 years, what we know from ice core records is that CO2 has fluctuated during glacial periods, which is like the last ice age, when we've had 1 to 2 mile thick ice sheets over mm-hmm. parts of North America. Where I live in Rochester would have been under a mile or two of ice. And CO2 then is typically 180 parts per million. That fluctuates naturally to about 280 parts per million, which is when we have much more temperatures that are comfortable for human beings today. And those fluctuations happen due to changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun, or the tilt of the Earth. And that's kind of what we look at as natural climatic changes. Mm-hmm. Well, right now, we've increased CO2 from 280 to 408 parts per million with associated temperature changes and changes mm-hmm. in the ocean. And we basically snapped ourselves out of this stable climate that's existed for at least the last 800,000 years, and likely longer. The last time we had CO2 concentrations this high was 3 million years ago, and the climate was much different then.
So it sounds like we're actually we're in this cycle where we're going from one extreme to where it might have been unlivable or uninhabitable once upon a time, billions of years ago, to a period of time when it was stable and we had the ability to live the way we have for the last hundreds or thousands of years. But now what I hear you saying is that we're moving in the opposite direction, where there is, in my own words, a decay of sorts that's happening that is really becoming a very direct threat to our existence. Am I catching that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, we are used to a certain climate, mm-hmm. and for example, we have a lot of cities on the coast. Most people live within 200 miles of the coast. 3 million years ago, which is where our CO2 concentrations already are and where our temperature is rapidly catching up to, sea level, we think, was 15 meters higher. That's our best estimate. 15 meters higher sea level. It would only take maybe 7 meters of sea level rise to make a city like New York functionally non-existent.
Wow. Okay. Well, I want to talk more about, what you're using to measure climate change, so that the viewers understand and how you know that climate is changing. Can we dig more into that?
Yeah, so we really use a variety of techniques. Of course, we have direct observations. We've looked at CO2 directly in the atmosphere from areas that are not near major industrial or urban centers. So our best curve comes from, or our best measurement of CO2 comes from Mauna Loa in Hawaii since about the 50s. We have temperature measurements that date back to the 1800s, and we can see how these are changing. We also look back in things like ice core records, and we can actually look at bubbles that were trapped in the ice and look at the CO2 concentrations in those trapped old atmospheric trapped atmosphere in old bubbles. So,
well, this is fascinating. This is really fascinating. I'm going to continue this because I want to dig deeper into this, but we got to go to break.
Okay.
And when we come back from break, we're going to really decipher this, because I want to make sure that our viewers understand exactly how this is affecting them. Legitimate Matters, your host, William Parris. We will be right back. You want to hear more of this. We'll be right back.
A United Nations agency says the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere shot up to its highest level in 800,000 years. According to a new report from the UN World Meteorological Organization, CO2 concentrations hit 403.3 parts per million last year. That's up from 400 parts per million in 2015. And while that might not seem like a big increase, the organization says 2016's jump was 50% greater than the average yearly increase over the last decade. The report cites a combination of human activities and a strong El Niño event as reasons for the surge. And the WMO's Secretary General warned in a statement, without rapid cuts in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, we'll be headed for dangerous temperature increases by the end of this century. Warnings like this aren't anything new, but environmental leaders are hoping to come up with some solutions soon. The UN's annual climate meeting will take place in Germany next month. During the meeting, officials will reportedly work on guidelines for the Paris Climate Agreement, which aims to prevent global temperatures from rising and reduce global emissions.
Our climate is changing. Science shows that carbon pollution and greenhouse gases that come from burning fossil fuel for power, transportation, and other activities are the main cause. Greenhouse gases trap energy in the atmosphere, causing it to warm. While this greenhouse gas effect is natural and necessary to support life on Earth, the large buildup of greenhouse gases is changing our climate. This can have a dangerous effect on human health and the well-being of our ecosystems. A warming climate will impact our water supplies, agriculture, power and transportation systems, as well as our health and safety. Some changes to the climate are unavoidable. Carbon dioxide can stay in the atmosphere for nearly a century, so the Earth will continue to warm in the coming decades. By making choices that reduce greenhouse gas pollution and preparing for the changes that are already underway, we can reduce risks from a changing climate. Don't wait. Act now on climate change. Learn more at epa.gov/climate change.
Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. Once again, I'm your host, William Parris. I'm having a great conversation with my new friend, Dr. Richard Smith, oceanographer, and we're talking about climate change and the effects between the ocean and the atmosphere. So, Richard, when we left the last segment, we were talking about so many different scientific jargon, but what I want to talk about and understand is the recent hurricanes that have hit the East Coast recently, Sandy in New York, and then recently Miami, and certainly the Caribbean islands, which have been devastated by recent hurricanes. Is this related to climate change?
It's difficult for us to link one individual hurricane to climate change, but what we know is that the frequency and the strength of hurricanes is expected to increase. They gain their power from heat in the ocean. We know that the ocean has stored a large amount of heat that has been added to the atmosphere through adding greenhouse gases, particularly CO2.
So that said, if the hurricanes are increasing, and the ones that we've had over the past several years have been historical, to say the least, and if they increase, then that's also affecting sea levels and all kinds of things like that. So what's going on as far as sea level is concerned? Are these storms having an impact on the sea level, and is this going to be a considerable threat for cities that line up along the coast of the United States?
Absolutely. So as we know, and we saw here in New York, there is a big storm surge associated with hurricanes making landfall. That is superimposed on top of sea level rise that we've seen since the beginning of the industrial era. Sea level rise on average is about 3 millimeters per year globally, but that's not distributed evenly across the globe. In New York City, we've seen about 11 inches of sea level rise since the beginning of the industrial period. So that essentially there was an extra foot of storm surge due to that extra amount of sea level that we've had. So essentially, sea level rise is going to continue, and it's going to increase. Our emissions of CO2 are not stopping anytime soon. They're actually increasing. We have huge ice sheets on Greenland, 1 to 2 miles thick, twice the size of Texas, that contain, if Greenland were to melt, that would be 23 feet of sea level rise globally.
Is it melting?
It's melting much quicker than we thought, than our worst case scenarios.
Okay, so let's talk worst case scenario.
Worst case scenarios keep increasing every 5 years. The International Panel on Climate Change puts out a report about every 5 years. In 2008, worst case scenario by 2100 was about 1 meter of sea level rise. By the 2013, half a meter of sea level rise. By the report that came out in 2013, worst case scenario was 1 meter of sea level rise. A paper just came out showing we could have as much as 2.5 meters of sea level rise. So our worst case predictions have increased the last two sets of of 5 years.
So realistically, based on what I'm hearing, is the devastation that occurred a number of years ago with Katrina and New Orleans is a reality, is something that could realistically happen in New York or Miami or in certain places along the coast, because flooding is not uncommon even today as it is now. So with what you're talking about and what I'm hearing is that the potential for that, for us to live through that devastation or reality is more real than we might be paying attention to. We might be going along our daily lives thinking like, oh, that doesn't happen here, but it could. That's
right. Well, there's a lot of water locked up in ice sheets on Greenland, but also in Antarctica. And in fact, all that ice represents over 200 feet of sea level were to all melt. Now, we're not saying it's all going to melt, but what is happening is that it's melting much quicker than we think.
Okay.
And the fastest parts of Greenland now are depressing about 27 feet a year.
Wow. There's something else that I read, and it was part of your research, which is carbon burial in fjords.
Yep.
Can you help? What is that?
So fjords are
in layman terms.
Yes. So fjords are these really beautiful places. When I was doing my PhD work, I studied fjords in New Zealand, and that's part of this national park with these pristine forests. And they're long, narrow, deep estuaries that were carved during the last ice age. So as glaciers advance, they scour the land.
So we see those as an average common person. We would see that you have a mountain on one side, and then you've got this deep valley, and then you've got this river that flows, you know, through these two mountains. And we look at it and we say, oh, that's so beautiful, and we want to take pictures. But that is actually a fjord.
That's right. Those are fjords. So they occur in Norway, Scotland, Canada, New Zealand, Chile. And what we find is that they really enhance the transfer of organic material on land to the ocean. So they really enhance carbon burial.
Oh.
Really, it has a radiator effect. You increase the surface area between land and the ocean. A place like New Zealand can get 11 meters of rain per year, and a seismic event can occur and just dump an entire forest into the fjord. That's a much quicker way to bury carbon than, say, a river that slowly carries material out and it gets broken down. So we find that fjords are a fraction of the ocean's surface area, yet they bury 10% of all carbon in the ocean, which is 100 times the ocean average. So they're really hot spots of rapid carbon burial, and we should keep these places pristine and undeveloped.
But that's not what's happening.
Yeah, well, it depends. Fortunately, in places like New Zealand, that is a huge national park.
Okay.
But that's obviously not the case globally, and we should keep that in mind.
Wow. Amazing conversation. I could talk to you for hours, but at the moment, we're going to go to break. Please stay with us, because we're still going to continue this conversation and talk about how all of this information and this and this scientific jargon could really affect you. It affects me. Don't go away. Stay with us. We'll be right back. This is Legitimate Matters.
Global warming is the biggest problem in the world today. This is New York now. This is what New York will look like if we don't stop global warming. We can stop global warming by recycling bottles, planting trees, using green power. Go green for Earth Day this year on April 22nd. The world is in your hands. Stop global warming before it's too late.
Hey, Gould, what are you doing? I was just getting ready to say something. You just took the mic from me.
You can't take the mic. This guy, it's just kind of like...
Hey, are you guys bullying me?
Yes.
What's up?
Hey guys, we're on the set of Legitimate Matters here with William Parris. We've just had a great time. We want him down on G Team Radio. What do you say, Gould?
Absolutely. There's a ton of fun and a great location up here at the Burnick Hotel in Manhattan, 21st floor. And we just spent the afternoon talking about how to make small business more successful.
Shooting the business breeze.
Yeah, and giving William's listeners an opportunity and his viewers an opportunity to work with us directly through our 3-minute video content. So
sounds like
we're looking forward to that.
Did you guys enjoy being on the show?
Oh, it was a blast.
You guys were great. I loved it.
Who are you again?
Oh, well, now I don't remember. But anyway, for those that are watching, Legitimate Matters, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. All you have to do is search for Legitimate Matters on YouTube. Subscribe. Thanks, Gibbons. Thanks. I did that backwards. Gibbons, Gould.
Well, we're twins. It's so hard to tell us apart. It's so hard to tell.
Separated at birth.
Yeah.
That's a wrap.
Legitimate Matters, William Parris. Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. Once again, I'm your host, William Parris, having an amazing and extremely interesting conversation with my guest, Dr. Richard Smith, oceanographer, talking about climate change. Rick, before we move any further, I want to really point out that you have your own business in oceanography, and I would like you to tell us about that.
So I started Global Aquatic Research about 4 years ago.
That's your company name.
That's my company. Yep, I'm the current owner and founder, and it's primarily an aquatic sciences consulting business. So the research that I do, as well as the research, we're really a network of labs and experts, and we perform a variety of services, from laboratory services. We measure very difficult to measure molecules like lignin that are the structural molecules in plants. We design equipment that helps to measure this. We set up laboratories. We have analytical services for bioremediation type research. And right now on Sodus Bay, our company is based out of Sodus, New York, and we design revetment structures to prevent against erosion for people who live along the lakeshore. We had record high water levels last year.
Okay, well that's amazing, and based on all of this and what your company does and your research, why is the research that you're doing on a daily basis a concern for us as humans?
Well, we need to learn what's going to happen. So we know the climate is changing. We need to know what are the historical analogs of this. And it's not just my research only that looks into that, but it's the whole scientific community, and everyone has their own piece of research that we do. And what we're really trying to do is understand the historical analog of what's happening right now with these rapid CO2 increases and the associated warming and sea level rise that we're seeing. So there's a lot at stake. Is this just a little blip on the radar, or is this massive climatic changes that we're going to have to adapt to as humans? And if so, how long is that going to take? So that's what we're continually doing new research to try to hone in on that. And it's very difficult because of the rapid change. There's no historical analog for what's happening right now.
Can you tell us about chemical munitions and pollution, and how, because I want to touch on that, because this is something that everyone can pay attention to and understand that they play a role in this. And tell us about that, about pollution and pollution in the ocean. What is there? What's in it? And how is that pollution affecting climate?
That's right. So there are all sorts of different pollutants in our environment, everything from mercury to PCBs and lead and so on and so forth. And because I study the detailed transformations of organic molecules, I can take that research and apply it to pollution studies from organic pollutants. And after I got my PhD, I was working at the University of Connecticut on a few Department of Defense projects where we studied chemical munitions in aquatic systems. So these are explosive compounds that have been released from dump sites. For example, after World War I and World War II, surplus and damaged munitions were just dumped into the ocean.
Munitions, just say munitions. I understand what munitions is, but someone watching just said munitions.
Yeah. So these are, for example, TNT is one that we all know.
Dynamite.
So yeah, exactly. So these are
Right.
used in explosive in bombs, ammunition,
Right.
and they're produced. I mean, in the U.S., we manufacture 2 million pounds of this annually. So if we're talking about pollutants, these are manufactured on an industrial scale, and they're spread all across the globe too during times of war.
So this is just dumped into the ocean.
Yeah, basically taken out on barges and dumped into the oceans in these large dump sites, and they rust through the iron casings and get out into aquatic systems, and we know they're toxic to humans and marine and land animals. So what I study is the detailed transformations of these. What compounds do they turn into? Do they break down into harmless constituents, or are they taken up by seafood? Do they pose a threat to humans? So what our research really showed is that the structure of the molecules really determines their environmental fate, and we can use that to move forward. When we develop molecules that have an industrial use, we should be developing ones that break down easily in the environment and are not concentrated up the food chain.
But that's not the case.
That's typically not the case. For example, the next generation of military munitions is to look at insensitive munitions, ones that are safer for transport and manufacturing, but we should also be looking at ones that are going to be safe for the environment, because that relates back to human health and safety as well.
So Rick, in the next, I would say 45 seconds, with all of this conversation that we've been having, tell us, why should we be concerned as humans? I see movies that that suggest that there is going to be just absolute disaster as a result of, you know, the climate, and just sheets of ice will start raining down from heaven. You know, why should we be concerned? What's the takeaway at the end of the show?
That's right. Well, and we should be careful about, you know, some people look at those and it can discredit the science in a way because it can be viewed as too alarmist. And really, the pure science of this is already alarming. We've altered our environment in ways that we will never recover from. 90% of all the large fish in the ocean have been fished out: tuna, sharks, billfish, things like that. We have pollution on a large scale, and it's not stopping anytime soon.
Wow.
We know the climate state we're snapping out of now, it will take millions and millions of years to get back to. So there's all sorts of reason to be concerned in every facet that you look at.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you once again for watching Legitimate Matters. Tune in next time as we continue this very important conversation with my guest, Dr. Richard Smith. We always appreciate you watching Legitimate Matters. I'm your host, William Parris. I am so excited. This is part of the second season of Legitimate Matters. So here we are. We're in the studio right now. I've got my crew going on. This is a season that you don't want to miss. We're taking it up a notch. It's going to be exciting. We've got hot topics. We've got the Richard Rosario story. We've got Carl Gould returning back, talking about building small businesses. We've got so much going on. We've got a digital marketing expert, the former vice president of JP Morgan Chase has been one of my guests, so you're going to see that as well. So stay tuned. Follow me on YouTube. And don't remember, subscribe to my YouTube channel. That's Legitimate Matters on YouTube. Don't miss it. You want to be here, and remember, whatever you have in your mind, it's legitimate and you matter. Welcome back once again to Legitimate Matters. This is your host, William Parris. Legitimate Matters is a show that is designed to inspire my viewers to make informed decisions to live their best life.